So last weekend was pretty cool for me, I have to say. My oldest daughter was a flower girl at my sister's wedding, and I got to perform the ceremony. So yeah, really cool, one of the honors of my life. And because of the role that I played last weekend, I spent a lot of time thinking about weddings and marriage, and particularly my own, and just how much it's grown and changed over the last 10 years, and how rewarding marriage can be and how hard it can be. The things that we have fought for and the things that we have fought about. And wow, I just have to say, I laughed a lot. Like some of the things that my wife and I have fought about over the years, unbelievable. Unbelievable. I mean, I think I'm convinced that most couples, they have at least one thing, like that dumb fight that you have way too often, you know? Some of you are wondering if that number can't be like 5 or 6 things. But for us, believe it or not, one of the things that we fought about a lot early in our marriage was what to watch on TV. I don't know how else to explain it other than to say that in the golden age of television, 2 immature 20-somethings could rarely agree on what it meant to honor Jesus and honor each other in what we watched. So I was talking to a counselor about this one time, and I was just explaining how frustrated I was, and he says, you know, it's pretty interesting that often the presenting issue for couples is not really the issue. And that you guys may think you're fighting about what to watch on TV, but you're probably fighting about deeper things like trust or happiness. He said, what you need is a principle that will help you guys agree to make wise decisions in these gray areas of life. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant, of course, a principle. So took that home, we talked about it, and came up with the principle for our house. The problem is that we could never agree on how to apply the principle that we had agreed to. We were both really good at strictly enforcing it with the other person, and both really good at finding loopholes for ourselves. And it seemed like no matter where we would draw the line, it always kind of felt random. And because it felt random, it never seemed to solve the problems. So back to the counselor I went. I was like, hey, nice advice, dude. The principle thing, really working out. We're having the same dumb fights. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, Tyler, there's a world of difference between policing the boundaries and pursuing the person. And I was like, wow. And as we unpacked that, I began to realize that when I first came to him, I thought I wanted help fixing or improving my relationship. But what I really wanted was a way to bend reality back in the direction of my desires. The truth is, I just wanted a better way to get what I wanted. There's a world of difference between policing the boundaries and pursuing the person. And he said, you know, policing the boundaries, that's what people do. Policing the boundaries of the principle is what you do when the thing you want is more important than the person you're in a relationship with. But the whole point of the principle is to give you guidelines and guardrails in your pursuit of another. This advice, this simple phrase, it changed so much for me in the early days of our marriage. It helped us make a positive difference. But that's not why I'm sharing it with you now. You see, this isn't just good advice for couples who are stuck in dumb fights. This is good advice for all kinds of areas of life, including what we're going to talk about today. See, as many of you know, we're right in the middle of a series called Open-Handed. And the whole premise of this series is that we, as followers of Jesus, we are invited into a way of being in the world that communicates a deep conviction that we are blessed more than anybody else in the world, and we have been blessed to be a blessing. Last week, Caleb talked about the fact that we live in a very anxious world. And in this world, it just effortlessly conforms us into this kind of closed fist posture of worry about tomorrow and fear about the unknown future. And in a world like that, as followers of Jesus, we are invited into the open-handed posture of gratitude, learning to see all of life as a gift from God and saying thanks to Him as often as we can for as many things as we can. And so today we're gonna build on that. We're gonna take the next step. But before we do, I need to give you fair warning. because today we are going to be talking about something that is very personal and very private to most of us. We're going to be talking about our stuff, our time, our resources, our money, our possessions. We're going to be talking about our stuff. And the question that we need to answer is, if all of life is a gift from God, then how should I view and what should I do with the gifts that God has given to me? What should I do with my stuff? But as soon as I ask that question, I immediately know that we're going to face a bunch of challenges. Because this is a big room. There's a lot of people in here. There's a lot of people watching online. We come from different backgrounds, different family experiences, different formative experiences when it comes to stuff. And even more than that, I am well aware that in a room this size, we are all managing different lifestyles. And we do not all possess the same access or amount of resources. And so how on earth do we all get on the same page when it comes to stuff? Well, at least in theory, that's the value of a good principle, right? I mean, in theory, at least I'll share with you, my operating assumption is that if you are in this room or watching online, then you are at least open to the stated mission of this church, which is practicing the way of Jesus together. Which means, in theory, that I should just be able to stand up here and hold high a principle of Jesus, something like this. Watch out, says Jesus, and beware of all greed. Your life doesn't consist in the sum total of your possessions. But instead, says Jesus, this is what you should search for, God's kingdom. Then all the rest will be given to you as well. Should be able to just kind of hold that up. We'll all nod our heads like, yep, that's a great principle. And then we leave and we go and live it out. But that's not how it works, is it? You see, there's something else lurking within all of us. Between the principle and the practice, there is this thing we call desire. And desire is the reason that the moment I descend from the principle into its implications, the moment we start talking about specific decisions or spending habits or lifestyle choices or income levels or anything like that, the moment we start talking about that, man, it starts to feel very personal. That's when we kind of get maybe a little quiet, a little protective, a little defensive. That's when we start policing the boundaries of our lives, looking for any way that we can to bend reality back in the direction of our desires. And so my encouragement to you today is just to remember that there is a world of difference between policing the boundaries and pursuing Jesus. Policing the boundaries is what you do when you want to protect your desires. But pursuing Jesus is what you do when you are ready to change your desires. But before we get to the principle today, we need to talk about kind of our cultural moment, because our culture presents us with some pretty unique challenges around the areas of desire. And it's worth realizing that it's not always been this way, and it's worth seeing how we got here. So a brief history lesson. In the early 1900s, America faced a new economic problem. In the advent, decades on from the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the new problem was that we suddenly had factories full of machines that could produce more in terms of quality and quantity than ever before. The problem, though, was that the consumer appetite wasn't nearly strong enough to meet this new power of production. And so companies began to wonder, is it possible? Could we make people want more? As one Wall Street banker of the time puts it, we must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. And wouldn't you know that at just the right time, along comes a man named Edward Bernays. You may not have heard of him, but you've almost certainly heard of his uncle, the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. And Freud was the guy who believed that human beings are basically irrational. That we like to think of ourselves as driven by logic and reason, but the truth is that we are far more driven by these unconscious impulses and passions and desires. And Freud's enduring insight was that if you want to change people, what you have to do is discover, activate, and then channel those desires. But it was his nephew, Bernays, who first had the idea of taking all of these insights in psychological research and seeing if you could put them to work, turning Americans into consumers. In a documentary about his life, they tell the story of one of his early successes. So in the early 1900s, tobacco companies were really frustrated because it was not socially acceptable for women to smoke, at least in public. And so they came to Bernays and they said, man, we're losing out on like 50% of our market share, or potential market share. Could you help us with that? And he had some ideas. He said, yeah, let me see what I can do. And so he goes around and he starts paying women, young women in the suffrage movement, to smoke when they're at their rallies and out in public. And he said, when you light up your cigarettes and people ask you why, don't just tell them you enjoy smoking. That's a boring answer. Tell them instead that you're lighting torches of freedom, just like the Statue of Liberty. You see the idea, right? If you can connect smoking with ideas about liberation and empowerment, you can get women, you can get people to break social conventions. This is from the documentary. So this success made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to act against their interests if you linked products to desires and feelings. The idea that smoking made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel independent. For Bernays, this was confirmation that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen in the world. You should know that Edward Bernays is known as the father of American advertising. We have him to thank for modern concepts like public relations and marketing. And it's his methods of manipulating and then weaponizing desire that are the foundational elements of the American consumer economy today. Which means, if that theory of the case is even directionally correct, then it means that you and I live in a culture now that is meticulously designed to make us believe that my life equals my stuff, my identity, my security, my safety, my future, my happiness, my purpose. It's all bound up in my stuff, which is a terrible idea. But that doesn't stop it from being appealing to us. I mean, how else do you explain the fact that we are a culture of perpetual consumer debt, borrowing tomorrow's resources to pay for today's desires? We are a culture that consumes more material resources than any society in history. In the last 50 years, home sizes have tripled, and now the average person owns 300,000 items at least in their home. We are a culture that seems content with consuming thousands of advertisements every single day. And one of the most stable businesses to get in right now is off-site storage. We live in a culture where we are content to carry around phones and devices, yet we know that tech companies spend billions of dollars weaponizing and manipulating our psychological weaknesses and biases to get our attention so that they can monetize our desires. We know they do it, and yet we tolerate it. And yet, for all of this talk, for all of this focus on human desire and consumption and materialism, it's worth noting that almost every indicator of human flourishing and happiness is in decline at the precise moment that we have more stuff than ever before. This is a problem. This is a problem for people like us. And so we're going to dig into the scriptures today, and we're going to try to figure out if Jesus can help us with that. In the documentary I mentioned to you a moment ago, it's interesting, Edward Bernays' daughter is interviewed talking about his life and legacy and his kind of view of humanity. And she said that, here was a man who spent his life trying to figure out if he could change the desires of people, trying to figure out what it would take to turn people into consumers, into the kinds of people who will find their happiness and their life and their identity in their stuff. And when he saw how easy it was, he decided that people are stupid. Seriously. She said that was one of his favorite words. He thought people were so stupid. He talked about it all the time. Fortunately, though, the Bible has a little bit more grace for us than that. It's not that we're stupid, but we have bought into a lie. We live like this because we have been deceived. For example, you may remember that in Jesus' famous parable of the sower, as he's talking about these different seeds, he says some fell in among the thorns, and the thorns choked the life out of the seed. And then he explains, he says, this refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. Paul says this to his young protege, Timothy. He says that those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and dangerous lusts, which drown people in devastation and destruction. The love of money, you see, is the root of all evil. Some people have been so eager to get rich that they have wandered away from the faith and have impaled themselves painfully in several ways. Now, I want to make sure that I'm being abundantly clear about what we're saying. The Bible's not saying that desire is the problem itself. It's saying what we've just recognized together, that our desires are easily confused and manipulated. And the Bible, despite how critically it often speaks of money and possessions and stuff, it actually never lays the blame at those things at the foundation. Instead, what it seems that the New Testament writers are often more interested in is not how much stuff we have, but what we do with our stuff and what our stuff does to us when we have it. And so if you have a Bible today, and I hope that you do, we're going to be in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. And while you're pulling it up on your phone or opening up your Bible, let me just set a little bit of context for you. So at the beginning of Luke chapter 12, we are told that thousands of people have gathered to listen to Jesus as he teaches his disciples. And right in the middle of this teaching, someone from the crowd speaks out and they interrupt Jesus in the middle of his teaching. We read this in verse 13. Someone from the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, you wouldn't know this unless you had read the verses that came before it, but this is a total non sequitur. It has nothing at all to do with what Jesus was just talking about. This is a guy who, seizing a moment, he's going to interrupt Jesus, get him on the record in public so that he can have ammunition against his brothers, so that he can try to bend reality back in the direction of his desires. So Jesus, understanding this, responds, "Tell me, my good man, who appointed me as a judge or arbitrator over you?" Like, what? Why are we talking about this? But it's interesting. Jesus, though he doesn't take the bait, he also doesn't just dismiss this guy out of hand. He doesn't just go back to what he was talking about after the guy quiets down. Instead, he sees a teachable moment for his followers. And so he turns his attention from this guy back to his disciples, and he says this, "Watch out," he said to them, "and beware of all greed. Your life doesn't consist in the sum total of your possessions." And then he tells them a parable. Let me read it over you. He says, "There was a rich man whose land produced a fine harvest. 'What shall I do?' he said to himself. 'I don't have enough room to store my crops.' 'I know,' he said. 'I'll pull down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. Then I'll be able to store all the corn and all of my belongings there. And I shall say to my soul, Soul, you have many good things stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and have a good time.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this very night your soul will be demanded of you. And now who's going to have all the things you've gotten ready?' That's how it is," said Jesus, "with someone who stores up things for himself and isn't rich towards God." Now, this is a pretty famous parable. You've likely heard it before, so just a couple of quick observations. Notice first that Jesus actually ascribes credit for the bountiful harvest to the ground itself. And I think this is kind of a coy way of pointing out that the rich farmer, he's not self-determined. He, like all of us, is simply the beneficiary of a God who would create a world where the ground is ordered towards producing in the first place. If you have eyes to see it, all of life is always a gift from God. But notice, second, that this fact is completely lost on the rich farmer, which is why he asks, what should I do with all of my stuff? He suffers from what Andy Stanley calls the consumption assumption, the belief that everything that comes into my hands is for my benefit. That's why his immediate answer is, I'll tear down my barns, I'll build bigger ones, I need more places to store more stuff. You see, he has concluded that the quality and condition of his life can be measured by stuff. Perhaps this is because he doesn't want to ever have to depend on anybody ever again. Perhaps this is because he's anticipating a future lean harvest where he can take this surplus and sell it for a profit to those who are less fortunate, take advantage of them. Perhaps this is just a status thing, a way for him to make a name for himself. But whatever it is, he believes that my life equals my stuff. And the more stuff I have, the better off I am. And so notice finally how God responds to him. He calls him a fool. But he doesn't call him a fool because he is the rich farmer. And he doesn't call him a fool because he has an abundance of stuff. God's the one who provided him with all of that stuff in the first place. God calls him a fool because of what he does with his stuff and because of what he has allowed his stuff to do to his heart. I mean, can't we imagine the inverse of Jesus' story? Couldn't we imagine a world where there's a rich farmer who lives the way we're advocating for in this series with open hands? And after a year of abundant harvest, he stops first to express his deep gratitude and thanksgiving to the God who would provide all of those things in the first place. And then, because he's the kind of person who seeks first the kingdom of God, he begins to wonder to himself not so much how to adjust his lifestyle to fit his new circumstances, but rather how his new circumstances might become a conduit of God's blessing to other people. The reason the person in Jesus' story is a fool is because he is not the kind of person who is prepared to handle the superabundant blessings and gifts of God. These resources, which could have been for him a great opportunity, have instead become the source of a great deception. And when it comes time for him to give an account of his life, his closed fist approach to stuff has left him empty-handed before the God of the universe. And Jesus concludes the parable with this: that's how it is with someone who stores up things for himself and isn't rich before God. This is the line that should get your attention. This is the line that tells us that Jesus wasn't just talking to first century rich farmers, but he's talking to everyone who lives in God's world. Everything is a gift from God, and we will give an account for how we use the gifts that he gave to us. What Jesus is talking about here sounds really similar to what economists mean when they talk about opportunity costs. An opportunity cost is just the idea that every time you say yes to something, there are a bunch of hidden no's in there somewhere as well. When you say yes to spending your money on that thing, you are also saying no to spending that money on everything else. When you spend your time on this thing, you are also saying no to spending that time on everything else. It doesn't mean it's automatically that you made the wrong decision or that it was a bad decision. It's just a way of recognizing that you and I, we are limited people. And we cannot seize every opportunity. So we have to make choices. And the value of learning to see your life through this lens is to reveal a very simple but profound truth that we all kind of know. And it's that our limited time, energy, and money are only as valuable as what we choose to spend them on. Our gifts are only as valuable as how we choose to use them. And according to Jesus, it seems to be the case that the closer you and I put ourselves to the center of the picture, the harder it is to honor God with our stuff. The more we spend on ourselves, the more opportunities we seem to miss. That's a big deal for people like us who live in a culture like this. And that's why I think we need a practice that helps us keep our desires in check and maybe even reshape our desires so that we don't become controlled by or consumed by our stuff. And so the practice that I want to briefly chat with you about in our time remaining is the practice of simplicity. Now, this has been defined many different ways, many different terms throughout Christian history to define this practice. But my favorite definition right now comes from John Mark Comer, who says this. He says, simplicity is limiting the number of possessions, expenses, activities, and social commitments that we allow into our lives so that we remain free to live into God's kingdom. Now, again, I want to make sure I'm being super clear on what I am and am not saying. I'm not saying that you tomorrow need to sell everything but your toothbrush. I'm not saying that you can never have fun or never spend money on yourself, never take a nice trip, never have nice things. This is not a backhanded way of trying to make anybody feel guilty or manipulate you into giving more money to this church or anything like that. The practice of simplicity is simply a way to take seriously the principles of Jesus, to seek first the kingdom of God. In other words, the practice of simplicity is a way of getting to this word, enough. It's a way of defining the word enough that's personal and compelling and clear. A way of defining enough that makes sure that you meet your needs and your desires and that you seize opportunities in the kingdom of God. And so let me just ask you really simply the question, how do you know when you have enough? How do you know when you have enough? That can be kind of a hard question to answer, can't it? I mean, enough, it's based on the circumstances of our lives and the amount of resources we have and all kinds of things. A student working a part-time job for minimum wage, they're going to need a different definition of enough than a school teacher. And a school teacher is going to need a different definition of enough than a hedge fund manager. But it doesn't really matter who you are or how much you have or how you choose to define it. There's one thing that we all need to keep in mind. There are only two ways to try and get to enough. The first is to consume and accumulate your way more and more, trying to find enough. And the other way is to limit your desires, or at least channel them in a different direction. And I think the point that Jesus is inviting us to consider with his teaching today is that enough is not so much this objective number, this specific number or amount out there somewhere that we all have to conform to. Enough is much more about a state of heart and mind that is reflected in a lifestyle. You see, that's the value of simplicity. It helps you define enough in such a way that leaves space for God's kingdom and for other people. So, now for the hard part. How do we actually practice simplicity? How do we apply this principle? So as we close, I just want to give you a few ideas and just invite you to listen as the Spirit of God may encourage you to do one or more of these things. But steps into the practice of simplicity. The first is to just start with a why. Listen, changing your consumer habits, reordering your desires, adjusting your lifestyle, these are hard things to do. It's okay to own that. And it also means that you and I need a compelling reason to change. So let me just ask you, what kind of difference could you make to the kingdom of God if you were just a little bit of a better steward of the resources he's given you? Who could you be available to? What would you be available to do if you weren't already so overcommitted? What kind of life could you live if you started to live differently? For example, over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking to you about the Timothy Initiative. It's one of our global partners. They plant churches amongst unreached peoples all over the world. And we've said that in the next year, in 2024, we want to plant 250 churches with them, and it costs $400 to plant a church, to reach people who have never heard the gospel before. And as you've heard that, maybe you thought a few things. Maybe you thought, oh, wow, I could do a lot with $400 myself. Or maybe you thought, man, that sounds like a cool opportunity, but I just don't have the money to do that right now. That's okay. That's okay. This is not a guilt trip. If it's not the right move for you right now, that's okay. All I'm trying to do is bring up the idea that if you began to take the practice of simplicity seriously, there might be a future version of you that could afford to do something like that. Still more than that, there might be a future version of you that would hear that opportunity and think it was a good use of your resources. That you would think it's a good opportunity. Maybe the only why you need to start stepping into simplicity is the idea that there's a future version of me that will be able to see and seize kingdom opportunities, and I want to become that kind of a person. Second step into simplicity. Practice saying no to yourself. Maybe this week it's as simple as saying no to some planned consumer purchase that you have in mind. You've been doing research, just say no. Maybe for you it's renting instead of buying, or borrowing instead of renting. Could you go a day, a week, a month without making an unnecessary consumer purchase? Give it a try and see how you do. Discover the condition and state of your heart. Or maybe for you, the practice of saying no looks more like turning off the things that activate your desires. Spending less time on your phone, less time on social media, deleting shopping apps, unsubscribing from those marketing emails, whatever it takes to get rid of some of those things that just activate those consumer desires within you. Or maybe for you, it's saying no to an expendable commitment. Generally speaking, commitments are like a good thing in our lives. They tether us to others. They help us belong to something bigger than ourselves. But it is also true that most of us are overcommitted. We have said yes to too many otherwise good things, and the unintended consequence of that is that we don't have enough space to say yes to some really important things. So practice saying no to yourself. But the last step into simplicity that I'll offer is just to simplify something in your lifestyle. A lot of options here, but the idea is get practice getting rid of some stuff. Change your environment so that it better reflects your desired lifestyle and your desired future. Easy way in for a lot of people here is with clothes. Could you maybe set a limit on the number of items you're willing to own at any given time and give the rest away? Maybe for you, it's finally cleaning out the garage so you can park your cars in there again. Or going room by room through your house and giving away or getting rid of or selling all of the stuff that you never needed anyway and you rarely, if ever, use. Again, changing your environment to change your lifestyle. Then again, maybe it's none of those things. There's nothing magical about any of the suggestions that I just offered. There's nothing magical about the practice of simplicity. It is simply a means to an end. It's wisdom for followers of Jesus who want to seek first the kingdom of God and who want to make sure that they don't waste their lives and their resources on lesser things. And it is, above all, a way to pursue Jesus. So whatever you do this week, my encouragement is just to do it with open hands. And remember that there is a world of difference between policing the boundaries and pursuing the person. And so as we close today, I thought it would be cool to give the last word over to Jesus. And I just want to read over you what he says as he finishes the parable of the rich farmer. So let me tell you this, Jesus said to his disciples. Don't be anxious about your life, what you should eat, or about your body, what you should wear. Life is more than food. The body is more than clothing. Think about the ravens. They don't sow seed. They don't gather harvest. They don't have storehouses or barns, and God feeds them. How much more will he feed you? Think of the difference between yourselves and the birds. Which of you, by being anxious, can add a day to your lifetime? And so if you can't even do a little thing like that, why worry about anything else? Think about the lilies and the way they grow. They don't work hard. They don't weave cloth, but let me tell you, Not even Solomon in all of his glory was dressed up like one of them. So if that's how God clothed the grass of the field, here today and into the fire tomorrow, how much more will he clothe you, you little faith lot? So don't go about hunting what you should eat and what to drink, and don't be anxious. The nations of the world go searching for all that stuff, and your Father knows you need it. So this is what you should search for: God's kingdom. Then all the rest will be given you as well. Don't be afraid, little flock. Your Father is delighted to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make yourselves purses that don't wear out, a treasure in heaven that lasts forever, where the thief doesn't come near and the moth doesn't destroy. Yes, where your treasure is, there your heart will be too.